It was November 18th, 2019, and the Trinidad and Tobago Football Association president, David John Williams, was opening the country's new football stadium and complex. Attending that day was the president of the country, FIFA president Gianni Infantino, and CONCACAF's president, Victor Montagliani.
When I entered the doors of the TTFA as president, along with my team some 4 years ago, we confirmed what we already knew, that the organization was in dire need of restructuring and needed to be placed on a sound financial path. Ladies and gentlemen, while many would expect me today to beat my chest and campaign on the facility behind me, I will do no such thing. You see, this investment is just one spoke in the strategic wheel that is quickly accelerating to put Trinidad and Tobago football on a sustainable path.
That same day of the unveiling, Infantino lauded the TTFA to a local reporter.
In this region, in the Caribbean, in Trinidad and Tobago, you have great skills, you have great natural talent. What we need is the infrastructure and the structure. This is now here. So now, as the Prime Minister was saying earlier, there is no excuse anymore. You can only become world champion.
However, despite John Williams' boasts of turning around the Football Association, he would lose his bid for re-election just 6 days later. Now, less than 6 months later, FIFA is declaring that the Trinidad and Tobago Football Association is not fit for purpose and has appointed a normalisation committee to run football operations in the country. Today, we look at why Infantino and FIFA made such a drastic U-turn and why this might be a dangerous precedent for football associations around the world. So, who is John David Williams, and how did he end up becoming the FA president of Trinidad and Tobago?
He owns a local club called W Connection in our pro league in Trinidad and Tobago that's had a decent record.
Lasana Liebert covers football in Trinidad and Tobago and writes for the website wired868.com.
In fact, one of the strongest local teams in the pro league. And in fact, his club had Kenwyn Jones.
Jones! What a magnificent strike! Oh, right on the postage stamp.
Gareth Bale dawdles on it, gets pressed really well by Wilkinson, and when it falls to Kenwyn Jones, what a finish!
Kenwyn didn't start with W Connection, John Williams' club, but he was there for at least one season, and John Williams benefited when Kenwyn then moved to Southampton. He went to first, right? So that would have been his big sale, essentially. And then right now, Joven Jones in the States, So as a club owner, doing a decent job. Back in 2015, the president at the time, Raymond Timke, there were a lot of financial issues and feeling of incompetence and everything else. And because John Williams, ran a pro team and did a decent job, people thought that maybe he could bring a certain level of competence and good stewardship to the table, essentially. And that's how he was elected in late 2015.
So even at that election time, there were financial issues with the FA.
Yes. Jack Warner came off the scene in about, 2011? I think for the whole of 2012, Trinidad and Tobago didn't play a game. Warner left a black hole in Trinidad and to extend the Caribbean financially. It was total mayhem.
$750,000, dollars intended to help the victims of the Haiti earthquake, disappeared in Warner's accounts. In 2008, he received what sure looks like $10 million in bribes for making sure the next World Cup went to South Africa. And he got Nelson Mandela to visit Trinidad for a private fundraiser benefiting, you guessed it, Jack Warner as part of the deal. In 2006, he promised big bonuses to the players of the Trinidadian national team, and he never paid up.
There was not only no money at all, but there were loads and loads of debt, right? So it took a while. And in fact, for our 2014 World Cup qualifying campaign, Trinidad got knocked out in the very first round, the Caribbean round, against Guyana, right? Had never happened before. So it was our lowest level, essentially. The team was starting to perform again, right? We were quarterfinalists for 2 successive CONCACAF Gold Cup tournaments. So things were starting to pick up on the football side, but financially they hadn't quite cracked it yet. They had just negotiated a settlement for the World Cup players since 2006. They were only paid around that time, around 2014. They were finally paid. FIFA, there were issues in terms of accounts with FIFA. So that meant that the TTFA, a lot of the times, couldn't get its annual subvention from FIFA, which at the time would have been something like, I think, maybe 600,000 US a year, 700,000 US, something like that. That was the situation when John Williams came in. At the time, our debt stood at roughly 16 million TT dollars. That would be about maybe 1.6 million pounds or something like that, Now, when John Williams left, the debt was 50 million, about 5 million pounds. So you're talking about that debt rose about 3 times, although unlike Timkey, John Williams is not only getting the FIFA annual subvention every year, but vastly increased. Because under Infantino, the money paid out to countries, smaller, nations like Trinidad, went from about 600,000 US to 1.5 million. So John Williams was getting more than any football president ever did before. And yet the teams were doing worse than ever, and the debts were rising, people weren't being paid.
It's my impression that in 2015, FIFA actually tried to help the FA get their finances under control and better govern themselves.
I suppose just before that election as well would have been when the TTFA actually got its accounting straight about a year or so before. So money was finally starting to come in. So John Williams really came in at the best possible time to benefit from what was happening, with FIFA and the improvement to the TTFA, especially on the field. Our national team was ranked, I believe, something like maybe 52nd in the world at that point in time. That's when he came in. Again, when John Williams left, our team is ranked 106th in the world. There's no gauge you could possibly use that would show John Williams' tenure to be anything but a real disaster.
So on the field, the Trinidad and Tobago team became much worse under John Williams, and their debts rose considerably under his time as president. Why did the debts spiral out of control?
Well, the new administration intended to find out. That's the thing. John Williams started this project called the Home of Football in Trinidad. Now, FIFA has funding available for infrastructure, but you don't have to build your own ground. I mean, Trinidad, for a small country, we have quite a few stadia, right? Partly because I guess we hosted the 2001 World Cup in Trinidad as well and built new stadia for that. John Williams decided to build a new venue rather than use one of those stadia as essentially our home base and build a hotel. Now, John Williams' background, by the way, is as a contractor. So one of the issues the board and so on was having was that John Williams appeared to be the lead contractor for the project, right? And at the end of it, there was more than 16 million TT, that would be over just under 2 million US, unaccounted for, that apparently was paid in cash, to build the stadia. There were complaints about shoddy work and everything else. It was a mess. But the reality is that for years, it appears that a lot of the money John Williams was getting was going straight into the hotel that he may or may not have been benefiting from by being the lead contractor for this project. And that would have been one of the main issues during his tenure, and something that the administration under William Wallace had vowed to investigate.
So $2 million essentially disappears under this Home of Football. At any point, is FIFA or the Federation looking into where that money is going? It doesn't happen overnight, this sort of thing.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Previous board members, particularly one Keith Lok Loy, made a lot of noise about it. Of course, I wrote about some of the issues, but Lok Loy directly contacted FIFA and the official who had supervision of the project, let's say, who would have been Veron Musengo Umba. And the word coming back from Veron was that this is internal TTFA business, and that's for you all to sort out. essentially. So why John Williams was driving in TTFA into significant debt, and there were all these concerns about financial irregularity, FIFA refused to step in, refused to investigate, or so on.
As the situation in Trinidad and Tobago was unfolding, football writer and broadcaster Philippe Auclair recognized that this could have much bigger implications than at first glance.
There might be something in this story which is of importance not just to the region, even though the story in itself is very interesting, but also to the governance of the game more globally because of the type of process that Trinidad and Tobago Football Association found itself under, which is the so-called process of normalisation, which is anything but normal, believe me. And I thought, ooh, that's interesting. And it's also interesting because at the head of this process of normalisation is somebody who is very important within FIFA, who is the head of development for Africa and the Caribbean. Very strange, I have to say, region, which is not a region, but that's his role, which is Mr. Veron Musego Omba, who is a very, very old friend of and very close ally of Gianni Infantino. So I thought, let's have a look at it a little bit more closely and see what is going on there.
So we've just kind of discussed the last couple of years with Lasana about Trinidad and Tobago's football presidency, and it's now November of 2019. So who ends up running against John David Williams in the election?
At the time, there are three candidates at the election. So Mr. John Williams and two other people, and one of them drops out of the race after the first round and stays in basically against Mr. John Williams, William Wallace, somebody who is not, I would say, a football person, but he's a sports person, somebody who has been involved in cricket administration for a long time. And to, I suppose, Mr. John Williams' surprise, William Wallace wins the election by 26 votes to 20 in the second round. And the election, by the way, is conducted perfectly normally. There are absolutely no doubts about how democratic it was, how transparent it fitted in with the statuses of the association. But the fact is that, to the surprise of everybody, and especially since Mr. John Williams, and I think we have to come to that, had the full support and public support of Gianni Infantino.
He is one of these persons who can really make things happen with his energy, with his passion, with his way of working, and this is certainly inspiring, and that's why I'm very happy to be one of his friends.
Who had been there just 6 days before the election. Despite all that, William Wallace is elected president, which is a huge surprise to everybody.
Why is it such a huge surprise?
Well, because John Williams had only been in place for a few years. He was supposed to be the man who was going to take Trinidad and Tobago out of the Jack Warner years, so to speak, if such a thing is possible in a country where Jack Warner has got friends and enemies everywhere. But he'd only been placed, John Williams had been a crucial ally of Gianni Infantino, and Gianni Infantino had been a crucial ally of John Williams. As I said, 6 days before the election took place, a FIFA delegation was there with Gianni Infantino to open this so-called home of football. And Mr. Infantino, and I will quote you what he said, because I think the quote in itself will show you how strong the support was from FIFA, from the FIFA president at least, to the incumbent. And he said,
because Trinidad and Tobago Football Association was more or less in the same state as FIFA at that time. David was saying shambles. I say shambles is maybe a compliment to the state you found.
And he basically described Mr. John Williams as a teammate, and that in a situation of difficulty, teammates have got to stand for each other. To be honest, imagine that if, for example, in America, in the United States, imagine if Gianni Infantino, there was an election at the US Federation, and there were three candidates, and Gianni Infantino said, oh, by the way, this is the one you should be voting for. Can you imagine how it would go down? I don't think people would be necessarily too impressed by that. I also think people would question whether it was the role and within the capacity of a FIFA president, when there is an election and three candidates, to declare his preference in such an open and public way. So yes, it was a big surprise, because you think with the support of the man who is at the head of the global football governing body, this body which is also providing most of the member associations with funding, which is absolutely crucial to their existence, had just put a lot of money, $2.5 million, into this project. The Home of Football had just inaugurated it. And then a mere 6 days later, the man who's been supported publicly by Gianni Infantino is beaten. Now, that's a big surprise.
So Infantino is essentially already kind of tampering with the election before the votes have even happened.
Tampering might be a bit strong because, the election took place and there was no tampering in the electoral process because Mr. Wallace won fairly and squarely, 26 votes to 20. What he did, Gianni Infantino did, was to provide public support for one of the candidates, which is not something that is coherent with the duty of neutrality, shall we say, and fairness of a FIFA president. That is what we should say. I'm, of course, being very polite here, but I think this is already quite a serious thing that Mr. Infantino perhaps should be made answerable for.
Okay, so William Wallace is elected, but why is he elected despite kind of this huge support by Infantino?
Because the support by Infantino is not mirrored by the support in the county associations, which make up the Trinidad and Tobago Football Association, and that there is within, and there was already before the election, within the board of the TTFA, there were people who had been vocal opponents of Mr. John Williams' governance. One of them was Keith Lok Loy, for example, who is the gentleman who is in charge of the so-called Super League, which is in fact the second tier of Trinidad and Tobago football, and somebody who has assumed a very important role within the new administration. So there was already within the board, there were people who were not happy with what was going on. There were loads of questions asked in particular about this famous home of football and the way the money was being spent. And questions had been asked, and there have been, there's Mr. Lok Loy, I believe, who had gone to the High Court of Trinidad and Tobago to get access to the financial reports and found out that there were a number of irregularities. And of course, many people were unhappy with that. And because of that, they turned to a man who, to them, represented a change for change, and to get rid of Mr. John Williams, have a look at what had gone wrong, and put the federation back into an even keel, which, to be honest, was a pretty serious job, because after decades of Jack Warner and then what followed, there was a lot of work to be done.
So what are some of his first actions as president of Trinidad and Tobago?
To be honest, the first and last actions, because, we're talking about November 2019, and as we are now talking on 10th of April, they are no longer in charge. Even though they say they are in charge, they basically have been banned from doing suspended. So they've had, 3.5 months in which to do some work. And the work was, of course, to try and determine what the financial situation was and to conduct an audit of the finances of the FA, which they have done. It was also a case of trying to find a way to structure the debt, which they had started to do. They had got a couple of people, auditors, independent auditors, to have a look at it. They had made contact with people who could help with that. There was also matters to look at, which regarding the national team. They parted with the national team manager, which was a bit controversial, I must say. But I think most of the business was about, let's try and find out what exactly we're dealing with here. They had no time. They were elected in November 2019. In February, they had a visit from FIFA, from a delegation of FIFA, which stayed a few days, and in which they explained what they were doing, and they were very transparent about what they wanted to do, and they explained that, there were problems, but that they were looking at them, this is what they had put in place, and so forth. So this happened, and then the trapdoor opened, and the next thing they knew, a normalisation committee had been appointed by FIFA.
Now, you mentioned a normalization committee. Almost everyone listening, and even myself, before I really looked into this, didn't even know what that is. Can you explain what a normalization committee is and what it does and how common they are?
They should not be common, but unfortunately they are. It's a kind of a last gasp solution when federation, there are 211 of these which make up FIFA, when a federation finds itself beset with really critical problems. It could be of a financial kind, it could be government interference, it could be ineligibility of the people in place, it could be misdemeanors, it could be elections which are basically been fraudulent. All this, we're talking about really, really serious problems here. Really, really serious. When every single other recourse has been used, then FIFA says, okay, guys, you can't look after your own affairs. We've got to intervene directly. And sometimes they can intervene at the request of a federation. Now, It's quite common, and I'm just going to give you the name of a few countries in which there has been a normalization committee recently. I think there's one in Malawi has recently. Mali was a particularly controversial example, but also Argentina, Kuwait, Uruguay, Greece. So, and I'm only talking about recent interventions of FIFA who are basically coming in and taking over the affairs. They name, a bit like when a company goes into administration, and then administrators are nominated and take over the running of the FA and try to put things back into place. And so that's what happens. That is what is called normalization. It should be a means of control and governance which is used in last resort. But unfortunately, I'm afraid it's a process which is used, and I would even say sometimes abused by FIFA far too often in the recent past.
So FIFA is kind of saying your finances are such a mess that we need to come in and sort you guys out. Is that the idea?
Yeah. What is extraordinary, though, is that they have this idea 3.5 months after the election. And that 3.5 months before then, they were talking about how wonderful what was happening in Trinidad and Tobago was.
I think the page has turned with David, with the new CONCACAF, the new TTFA, the new FIFA, and the criticisms which are coming up here and there are exactly a result of the past, who maybe wants to or thinks that there is a comeback which can happen. Well, there is no comeback of the past.
So you think, hold on a minute, what has happened which justifies the fact that this federation, which you knew was in trouble, but you thought it was back, in business, a new administration is elected democratically, 3.5 months later, FIFA decides, no, we've got to intervene, we've got to normalize. And you think, why? I mean, I've looked long and hard about that, and I've talked to friends and colleagues of mine, and everybody had the same reaction, said, we don't understand. There are no reasons. The situation is bad in Trinidad and Tobago, as far as the finances are concerned. We've known that for years. And nobody knows it better than the people who are currently in place and are desperately trying to sort it out. Now, why on earth would FIFA need to intervene now, when beforehand they'd done nothing or turned a blind eye? And this is when it becomes something different. And this is where it becomes, I think, really interesting to understand how football is governed on the global scale by FIFA.
And what does that tell you about how FIFA governs on the global scale?
What it tells me about the way FIFA governs the global scale is that normalization is now a weapon. There is a weaponization of the process. I am sure that there are people who will justify it. I think that the justification is very slight in this particular instance, and that I think the fact that Mr. John Williams had been an incredibly strong supporter of Mr. Infantino since the very beginning, including since before Mr. Infantino was elected president of FIFA, is probably not completely to be set aside.
You know, the FIFA candidacy presidency is right around the corner. We've heard presentations from several candidates, both in Antigua and here now with Mr. Gianni Infantino. And we feel that from his presentation of all the candidates has been one that can help football in the Caribbean.
For me to receive this support here today is really very, very important in my way forward in the FIFA candidacy, I think.
Obviously, I have absolutely no way to prove this. I mean, I have no recording. I'm just saying I find the coincidence rather strange. Suddenly, the man that Mr. Infantino has supported, Mr. John Williams, who is also the first person in the Caribbean region who declared himself in favor of Mr. Infantino in the FIFA presidential election, which took place in 2016, suddenly Mr. John Williams, is no longer there. An ally has been lost, a strong ally, and suddenly FIFA intervenes. And it's a question that needs to be asked of FIFA. I don't think we're going to get a straight answer for that, which is, well, why didn't you normalize them before? Could it have to do with the fact that the new administration perhaps is not an administration that you feel as close to as the previous one? But why would that be the case? You've got to find a reason. This Occam's razor. What is the likeliest thing? Which is, take away the froth and all this sort of thing. Is there a reason that imposes itself to your mind? And you think, well, there's only one possibility, is the fact that the current administration is not one that FIFA enjoys working with. And it so happens that this administration has replaced somebody who was very much in favor. And it's very difficult not to draw the conclusion that there's a causal relationship between one and the other. Which is not saying, by the way, that there aren't problems with the TTFA. There are problems with the TTFA, but that's not new. We've known about that for a very long time. But what I'm saying is that this normalization process is a very, very powerful weapon to use or not to use. And the way it can be used opens itself to all kinds of interpretation, and which cast a doubt about the type of transparent governance that FIFA keeps telling us is now its modus operandi.
You spoke to Keith Lok Loy, chairman of Trinidad and Tobago's technical committee, for your piece in Josimar. What did he say the FA's reaction was to all of this?
They were stunned. They were very angry. They say that basically as long as Mr. John Williams was in place, FIFA were happy to turn a blind eye. And again, I stress this is what they're saying, because by turning a blind eye on what Mr. John Williams and his supporters were doing, they were also turning a blind eye on what FIFA itself was doing. Which is, quite a serious accusation, I would say. But what Mr. Wallace, Mr. Lok Loy and the whole board have said is that they will fight what they call an illegal decision, tooth and nail, and they've actually lodged an appeal with the Court of Arbitration for Sport. So this is going to go to the supreme jurisdiction in sport. So it's a mess.
Yet Trinidad and Tobago might not be the most concerning version of normalization that we've seen yet.
You could actually say, that what happened to the whole of the African Confederation, CAF, was a process of normalization. When on the 1st of August, suddenly the Secretary General of FIFA, Fatma Samora, suddenly found herself at the helm, basically, of the African Confederation. At the request, we're told, of the African Confederation themselves. And basically was in charge for 6 months, until February. And that was a kind of normalization process, which led to the publication of the PricewaterhouseCoopers report on, the financial wrongdoings within CAF and so forth. So it is a process which is far too common. But again, my fear is that it is being weaponized, which was not necessarily the case with previous FIFA administrations, perhaps not to the same extent.
And use this kind of as a threat to say, we're going to take over your administration if you don't kind of acquiesce to some of our desires.
You're not going to do that because that is clear interference and there are limits to what you can do. On the other hand, what happens is that the process of normalization is such a powerful one because it basically enables you to suspend people just like that. Statutorily, FIFA can do that. If they think that there is a problem of such magnitude in any FA, any country, which justifies the process of normalization, well, the FA has got to accept it. That's power for you. So obviously, yes, there can be a temptation to use it in a way which is perhaps not the way that it was thought of to start with, when it was supposed to be just a last recourse. The point is more that it is a process which is not supposed to be a weapon. And my concern is that it is turned into a weapon because it is extraordinarily powerful. And what is the end game? The end game is always to have control. The end game is to have the votes when you have the next presidential election so that you can remain in place. So what do you do to get that? Which is as old as FIFA. You're very generous, financially speaking, with the federations, the member associations, and you don't ask perhaps too many questions, so maybe not enough questions about the way the money is used, but the money goes out, and so the MAs are grateful and they will vote for you because you gave them more money than the other candidate, and so on. And then you've got this is the carrot, and then you've got the stick. If you don't behave, careful, because if you've done something wrong, we have this method of putting you back in the straight and narrow. You'd better do that, otherwise this could happen. And of course, things are not said like this. It's not that simple. It's something which is more, you don't even need to say it. You know that it's there. You know that you'd better do what you should be doing. Otherwise, maybe you're going to expose yourself to things that you don't want to be exposed to. That's the way I would say. It's much subtler than that. Though not in the case of Trinidad and Tobago, it's not exactly subtle, I must say.
Lassana Liburd is the CEO and editor of the website Wired868.com, which is where you can find ongoing coverage of this story and other Caribbean football news. Philippe Auclair is a writer and broadcaster, and you can read his exclusive interview with Keith Lok Loy on josemar.com. This episode was produced by John McKenzie and Hugo Chambray. I'm Josh Schneider-Weiler, and thanks for listening to Football Today. If you enjoy this podcast, why not subscribe to our new Patreon page or share an episode with a friend? See you next time.